Each exchange shapes the final verdict. Every camera uncovers reality. Grasping your legal protections, enforcing true justice.
Step outside right now.
You haven't explained why you're here.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I need you to step out.
Without a warrant, you're not entering my home.
Well, 3, 2, 1.
ICE Agent Daniel Rowland, badge number 7432 of the Minneapolis field office, made the worst decision of his 12-year career when he saw a black woman tending a garden in an upscale Minnesota neighborhood and decided something didn't look right. He circled back 15 minutes later, parked his government vehicle at the curb, approached the two-story home with his hand resting near his taser, and when Miriam Omar answered her own front door, Rowland demanded she step outside for immigration status verification without any legal justification. When Miriam, a retired civil rights attorney with 25 years of experience in immigration law, calmly refused and cited her Fourth Amendment rights, Rowland forced his way past the threshold and deployed his taser, sending 50,000 volts through her body while she stood in her own entryway. What Rowland didn't know was that the Ring doorbell camera had captured every second in crystal clear high definition with perfect audio. That this footage would go viral within 48 hours. That his moment of racial and immigrant bias would lead to a $10.7 million lawsuit that would bankrupt not just him, but his entire family. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe no one should be tased at their own front door for simply asserting their rights as a U.S. citizen, then make sure you like this video and subscribe. And stick around until the end to let me know if you enjoyed this story. Miriam Omar had spent her entire Saturday afternoon doing something she had dreamed about for years. At 54 years old, after 25 years as a civil rights attorney specializing in immigration law, she had finally retired with savings intact and bought the house she had always wanted in the Willow Creek neighborhood of Minnesota. The two-story colonial sat on a corner lot with mature oaks lining the street, the kind of address that whispered permanence and arrival. She had moved in 3 weeks earlier with her husband, and this spring afternoon marked her first real attempt at claiming the property as home. The sun hung warm and generous overhead as Miriam knelt in the front garden bed, still wearing the faded overalls she'd thrown on after breakfast. Tulip bulbs pressed into dark soil beneath her gloved hands. Rose bushes along the fence needed pruning, their thorny branches reaching wild after a season of neglect from the previous owners. She worked methodically, the kind of focus that had once helped her dismantle discriminatory policies in courtrooms now applied to arranging perennials by height and bloom time. A neighbor across the street paused while retrieving mail, offered a tentative wave. Miriam returned it with a smile, dirt streaking her forearm. She didn't notice the white SUV with government plates rolling slowly past the first time. Daniel Rowland had been patrolling the outer suburbs that afternoon, his route taking him through neighborhoods where complaints about undocumented workers had spiked in recent months. 15 years with ICE had sharpened certain instincts in him, though those instincts had begun to calcify into something harder, less discerning. When he spotted the black woman in overalls kneeling among the flower beds of a house worth 7 figures in a predominantly white enclave, his mind made the leap before his training could intervene. Gardener. Undocumented. Doesn't belong here. He circled the block, his justifications assembling themselves with practiced ease, vague reports of suspicious activity in the area, due diligence, routine verification. By the time he parked at the curb 15 minutes later and climbed out of his vehicle, his hand already rested near the taser on his belt, his shoulders set in the posture of authority preparing to be challenged. Inside the house, Miriam rinsed soil from her hands at the kitchen sink, the afternoon light slanting through windows she'd spent the previous weekend cleaning. Her phone buzzed on the counter. The Ring app notification showed a figure in tactical gear standing on her front porch, one hand raised to knock, the other hovering near his hip. She dried her hands slowly, her attorney's mind already cataloging details. No marked vehicle visible in the driveway, no warrant visible in his hands, no exigent circumstances apparent. The pounding started before she reached the door. Not a knock, a demand. She approached the threshold but didn't open it, instead activating the two-way audio on the Ring system. The camera's red recording light blinked steadily in the upper corner of the doorframe, unnoticed. Rowland's voice came through sharp and impatient, ordering her outside for questioning about her immigration status. His tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to compliance, his words stripped of courtesy or explanation. Miriam remained on her side of the door, her voice calm and level as she refused, citing the Fourth Amendment's protection against unlawful searches and detentions. She stated the facts clearly. This was her home. She was a U.S. citizen. He had no warrant. He had no probable cause. The silence that followed stretched taut. Roland's frustration manifested physically. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the taser more firmly. He insisted she matched a vague description of suspicious activity, his justification crumbling even as he spoke it. Miriam's composure seemed to him like defiance, her knowledge of constitutional law like obstruction. When she calmly explained again that this was her property and she was within her rights, his perception narrowed to a single conclusion: resistance. From the living room, Layla appeared in the hallway, Miriam's younger sister, who'd driven up from Iowa for the weekend to help with unpacking. She moved cautiously toward the commotion, her voice uncertain as she asked what was happening. Roland's attention snapped to her, his suspicion doubling. 2 women, both refusing to comply. He ordered them both to exit the house immediately for status verification, his voice rising. Miriam kept her hands visible, her body language deliberately non-threatening. She repeated her refusal, stated her rights again, asked for his badge number and supervisor's contact information. Roland began counting. 3, 2, 1. Then he moved. He forced his way past the doorway, his shoulder pushing against the frame as he announced Miriam's detention as a suspected undocumented immigrant. His hand reached for her arm. Miriam stepped back defensively, her hand still raised and visible, her voice steady as she told him he was violating federal law. The taser came out in one smooth motion. The probe struck her chest, twin barbs puncturing fabric and skin, and 50,000 volts coursed through her body in rapid pulses. Miriam collapsed onto the entryway floor, her muscles convulsing beyond her control, agony bright and total. Layla's scream cut through the air, raw and desperate. Roland moved efficiently, producing handcuffs and securing Miriam's wrists behind her back while she lay incapacitated on her own floor, taser probe still embedded in her chest. He radioed for backup, his voice clipped and professional, reporting a detained suspect and requesting additional units. Above him, the Ring camera continued recording in flawless high definition, capturing every word, every movement, every second of the illegal entry and assault. The backup units arrived within 12 minutes. 3 vehicles, 6 agents, led by Supervisory Agent Lena Vargas, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness. She stepped through the open door and surveyed the scene with the kind of careful attention that missed nothing. A black woman handcuffed on an expensive hardwood floor, taser probes trailing wires to the device in Roland's hand. A second woman pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face. No signs of struggle except what Roland had initiated, no contraband visible, no weapons, nothing that justified what she was seeing. Vargas demanded an explanation. Roland delivered it with confidence, describing suspicious behavior, evasive answers, resistance to lawful detention. His version of events painted himself as measured and professional, the women as uncooperative and potentially dangerous. Vargas turned to Miriam, still on the floor, and asked for identification. Layla retrieved Miriam's wallet from the kitchen counter with shaking hands. Driver's license. Minnesota resident. U.S. passport. Vargas then asked for proof of residence. Layla brought the deed, the mortgage papers, the homeowner's insurance documents, all filed in the organized folders Miriam kept in her home office. Vargas's expression hardened as she reviewed each document. The address matched, the name matched, the photograph matched. Nothing in Roland's story aligned with the evidence in her hands. She crouched beside Miriam, her voice quieter now, asking about her profession. Miriam, still recovering from the shock, her voice strained but clear, stated her background. 25 years as a civil rights attorney, specialization in immigration law, recent retirement. She listed the firm she'd worked for, the cases she'd argued, the policies she'd helped reform. The atmosphere in the entryway shifted like air pressure dropping before a storm. Vargas stood, slowly, turned to Roland, and pulled him aside. Her whisper carried just far enough for Miriam to hear the essential words: federal violations, career ending, lawsuit. The phrase that mattered most: civil rights attorney. Roland's face drained of color as the reality assembled itself in his mind. He had just tased a retired lawyer in her own home. A lawyer who specialized in exactly the kind of case he had just created. A lawyer whose expertise in immigration law and constitutional protections exceeded his own understanding by orders of magnitude. Vargas radioed for paramedics and an internal affairs supervisor. She photographed the scene with methodical precision. She informed Roland that he was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. In the corner of the doorframe, the Ring camera's red light continued blinking, its memory card filled with evidence that would soon reshape more lives than anyone in that entryway could yet imagine. The paramedics arrived 18 minutes after Vargas's call, their movements practiced and efficient as they knelt beside Miriam on the entryway floor. They removed the taser probes with careful precision, swabbed the puncture wounds with antiseptic, checked her vital signs with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they'd seen this before. Miriam remained lucid throughout, her voice strained but steady as she recounted the incident in clinical detail. No warrant presented, no probable cause articulated. No lawful justification for entry or detention. The paramedics exchanged glances but said nothing, their report forms filling with observations that would later become evidence. While the medical assessment continued, Vargas retrieved Miriam's phone from the kitchen counter and opened the Ring app at Miriam's direction. The footage began with Roland's initial approach, his hand already positioned near his taser before he'd even knocked. The audio captured every word of the exchange with perfect clarity. Miriam's calm assertions of her Fourth Amendment rights, Roland's escalating demands, the countdown, the forced entry, the deployment of the taser, Layla's scream. All of it preserved in high definition, with timestamps and metadata that would survive any attempt at dispute. Vargas's face went pale as she watched, her jaw tightening with each passing second. She'd reviewed hundreds of incident reports in her career, parsed countless officer statements, but video evidence eliminated all ambiguity. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't a judgment call made in the heat of crisis. This was a clear violation of federal protocols, constitutional protections, and basic human decency. She pulled Roland aside again, this time with two other agents as witnesses. His suspension became official in that moment, delivered in formal language that left no room for negotiation. Badge and weapon surrendered, access to systems revoked, immediate removal from duty pending the outcome of a full internal investigation. Roland's protest died in his throat as Vargas informed him that his personnel file was already being pulled, that whispers had begun circulating through the Minneapolis office about his history. Those whispers carried weight. 17 prior complaints over a 9-year span, most filed by minorities during immigration verification stops. Allegations of excessive force. Accusations of racial profiling. Reports of intimidation tactics that skirted the edge of protocol violations. Each complaint had been investigated, documented, and filed away with recommendations for additional training that Roland had completed with minimal engagement. Patterns that individually seemed manageable, but collectively painted a portrait of an agent whose biases had been allowed to fester unchecked. Inside the house, Miriam sat on her living room couch with ice packs pressed against the taser marks on her chest, Layla hovering nearby with water and tissues. The shock was beginning to fade, replaced by the kind of focused clarity that had once made Miriam formidable in courtrooms. She recounted her background to the remaining agents with quiet authority, describing her 25 years navigating the exact systems that Roland represented: immigration law, civil rights litigation, constitutional challenges. She'd advised clients through ICE raids, defended families against wrongful deportations, dismantled discriminatory policies through federal court challenges. The irony settled over the room like weight. They'd targeted an expert, someone who understood ICE procedures better than most of the agents in the field office. Someone who could recite case law from memory and identify procedural violations in real time. The underdog they'd assumed was vulnerable had spent decades wielding the law as both shield and weapon. Vargas secured the Ring footage, downloading it to an encrypted drive and documenting the chain of custody with signatures and timestamps. But Miriam, drawing on her expertise, recognized that internal investigations often move slowly, that bureaucracy could bury inconvenient truths. She made a call to a colleague, a civil rights attorney she'd mentored years earlier, who now ran a nonprofit focused on police accountability. They spoke for 17 minutes, Miriam describing the incident in precise legal terms, her colleague asking sharp questions about evidence preservation and media strategy. 6 hours later, after consultation and careful consideration, Miriam uploaded the footage to social media. The video spread with the kind of velocity that defied prediction. Within the first hour, 10,000 views. By morning, 2 million. By the end of the second day, the count had surpassed 8 million, the footage shared across platforms, embedded in news articles, analyzed frame by commentators and legal experts. The narrative wrote itself. A retired civil rights attorney, tased in her own home while tending her garden by an ICE agent whose assumptions about race and immigration status had overridden basic protocol. The Ring camera footage provided irrefutable proof, eliminating any possibility of competing narratives. Comments flooded in by the thousands, many sharing similar experiences of profiling, of being questioned in their own neighborhoods, of having their citizenship challenged based on appearance alone. National media outlets picked up the story within 36 hours. Cable news segments ran the footage with expert commentary from former ICE officials and constitutional law professors. Investigative reporters began digging into Rowland's background, uncovering the 17 complaints and requesting his personnel file through Freedom of Information Act requests. Broader patterns emerged as journalists contacted other complainants, documenting a systemic issue within Minnesota ICE operations where bias training existed on paper but rarely translated to changed behavior in the field. The personal incident transformed into a public scandal, amplified by timing and technology and the undeniable power of video evidence. As the footage circulated and comments multiplied with stories of similar profiling, questions emerged about whether cameras alone could truly end bias, whether technology was sufficient to reshape systems built on flawed assumptions. The conversation expanded beyond Miriam's case to examine the intersection of surveillance, accountability, and the persistence of prejudice in federal enforcement. Then the unseen twist emerged during the initial internal investigation. A document review uncovered sealed files from an ICE internal affairs inquiry conducted 4 years earlier, triggered by a whistleblower who'd reported Rowland for misconduct during a series of immigration raids. The whistleblower had received anonymous legal consultation during the process, guidance that had helped them navigate the complaint system and preserve evidence despite pressure to recant. The consultant's identity had been protected throughout, their advice delivered through encrypted channels and careful intermediaries. Cross-referencing the timeline and methodology revealed what investigators had missed before. Miriam had been the ghost advisor. She'd provided the legal framework that had nearly derailed Rowland's career, resulting in a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining that he'd resented ever since. The encounter at her door wasn't random chance meeting systemic bias. It was the past circling back, personal history colliding with present circumstance in ways neither of them had initially recognized. When Rowland learned this detail during his suspension interview, the reality became unbearable. The woman he'd tased wasn't just a lawyer. She was the architect of his previous humiliation, the invisible hand that had exposed his misconduct years before. The knowledge transformed his violation from a mistake into something that felt almost predestined, as if the universe had arranged for him to destroy himself against the one person who understood his weaknesses better than anyone. Miriam's husband returned home that evening from a business trip, walking into chaos he'd only glimpsed through frantic phone calls. He found his wife physically recovering but mentally sharpening, her legal mind already constructing the framework for what would come next. They sat together in the living room, Layla making tea neither of them drank, processing trauma that had invaded their home and shattered their sense of safety. But beneath the shock, Miriam felt something else emerging. Purpose, the kind that had driven her through 25 years of fighting institutional injustice. Retirement had never meant surrender. Outside, public backlash intensified with each news cycle. Protests organized in Minneapolis, demonstrators gathering outside the ICE field office with signs demanding reform and accountability. Civil rights organizations issued statements calling for systemic change. Politicians who'd previously avoided criticizing federal enforcement agencies suddenly found their voices, proposing legislation to mandate body cameras and strengthen oversight. Rowland's suspension shifted from paid to unpaid as the investigation deepened. His family began to feel the financial strain, bills accumulating as his income stopped. His wife started asking questions he couldn't answer convincingly. His adult children saw the news coverage, the viral video, their father's face attached to a national symbol of abuse and bias. Relationships fractured under the weight of public scrutiny and private shame. The viral wave continued building. Questions about hidden stories and unreported profiling, flooding comment sections across platforms. How many similar incidents had occurred without cameras to capture them? How many people had been targeted in their own homes, their citizenship questioned based on nothing more than appearance? The conversation demanded accountability while acknowledging how much remained invisible. Miriam sat at her dining room table surrounded by legal pads and case files pulled from her home office archives, Layla bringing coffee as evening faded to night. She drafted the initial complaint with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before, though never for herself. Federal civil rights violations, unlawful search and seizure, assault and battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress. She named ICE as an institutional defendant and Rowland personally, targeting both the system that had enabled him and the individual who'd chosen to act. The lawsuit preparation consumed the following week. Consultations with colleagues who specialized in federal civil rights litigation, experts who could translate the ring footage into legal exhibits, damage assessments that calculated both economic and non-economic harm. The viral footage had created public pressure, but lawsuits required different architecture, evidence chains, precedent citations, damage calculations that courts would accept. As Miriam filed the complaint in federal court, the public scandal crested toward legal confrontation. The viral wave channeled into formal proceedings where accountability would be measured, not in views and shares, but in verdicts and consequences that would reshape lives, careers, and the systems that had allowed this moment to occur. The lawsuit advanced with unusual speed, propelled by evidence so clear that procedural delays became difficult to justify. The ring footage eliminated discovery disputes. Rowland's complaint history undermined any defense of reasonable judgment. The revelation of Miriam's prior involvement as the anonymous advisor strengthened claims of intentional bias, transforming what might have been dismissed as a single mistake into a pattern of targeted misconduct spanning years. Court proceedings unfolded over 8 months, though the outcome became clear far earlier. ICE's legal team recognized the impossibility of their position during preliminary hearings, watching as Miriam's attorneys played the footage in open court, frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp. Expert witnesses testified about proper immigration enforcement protocols, each one emphasizing how thoroughly Rowland had violated them. Constitutional scholars explained Fourth Amendment protections in language accessible to jurors who would eventually decide damages. Medical experts described the physical trauma of taser deployment, the psychological impact of being attacked in one's own home. The settlement negotiations began in month 5. ICE's attorneys proposed $6.5 million to resolve all claims against the agency, avoiding a trial that would generate more damaging publicity and potentially expose other problematic cases in the Minneapolis office. The offer came with standard non-admission language, but Miriam's team pushed back, demanding acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitments to policy reform. The final settlement included the monetary amount, a formal admission that Rowland's actions violated federal policy, and a requirement that ICE implement enhanced bias training and mandatory body camera protocols for all immigration enforcement activities in Minnesota. But the settlement with ICE left Rowland personally exposed. Miriam's complaint had named him individually for his intentional violations, and federal law allowed personal liability for civil rights abuses committed under color of authority. The jury trial for Rowland's individual culpability lasted 9 days. His attorneys attempted to portray him as a dedicated agent making split-second decisions in uncertain circumstances, but the video destroyed that narrative. The countdown, the forced entry, the taser deployment against a woman who'd committed no crime and posed no threat. Jurors deliberated for 4 hours before returning a verdict assigning Rowland $4.2 million in damages. His attempts at mounting a defense crumbled under the weight of his own documented history. The 17 prior complaints became exhibits. Former colleagues testified about his pattern of aggressive behavior during routine encounters. The unsealed internal affairs file from 4 years earlier revealed warnings he'd ignored and training he'd dismissed. Even his own incident reports contradicted his trial testimony, exposing fabrications that undermined whatever credibility he'd retained. Criminal charges followed the civil verdict. Federal prosecutors, emboldened by public pressure and clear evidence, brought charges of assault, battery, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The trial lasted 3 weeks, resulting in convictions on all counts. The judge, citing the severity of the violations and Rowland's abuse of federal authority, sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. His career ended officially with the conviction, his law enforcement credentials permanently revoked. Asset seizures began while Rowland served his sentence. Court-appointed receivers identified his home equity, retirement accounts accumulated over 15 years, and joint savings held with his wife. Minnesota law allowed attachment of marital assets for civil judgments arising from intentional torts, meaning his wife's financial security dissolved alongside his own. The family home went into foreclosure. Retirement accounts were liquidated to satisfy partial payment on the $4.2 million judgment. Joint bank accounts were drained. Bankruptcy protection was denied because the judgment stemmed from intentional and malicious conduct, exempt from discharge under federal law. His marriage collapsed under the combined weight of financial ruin and public humiliation. His wife filed for divorce during his incarceration, the proceedings brief and bitter. Their adult children, who'd grown up proud of their father's service, now carried his surname as a burden. They stopped visiting, stopped calling. The estrangement deepened into permanent separation as they rebuilt their lives around the absence of a father whose choices had destroyed their family's foundation. Roland was released after serving 14 months with credit for good behavior. He emerged at age 42 with no career, no savings, no family, and a judgment that would follow him indefinitely. He found work at a warehouse distribution center, loading trucks for minimum wage, his earnings subject to garnishment that reduced his take-home pay to barely subsistence level. The garnishment would continue for life, every paycheck diminished by court order, ensuring that Miriam received payment on the judgment until death or satisfaction of the full amount. He moved into a studio apartment in a deteriorating complex on the outskirts of Minneapolis, living in isolation, broken only by mandatory check-ins with his probation officer. Former colleagues avoided him. His name remained searchable online, forever attached to the viral video that had exposed his bias to millions. He became a cautionary figure, referenced in training sessions and policy discussions as an example of authority abused and consequences earned. While Roland's life disintegrated, Miriam's expanded into new purpose. The settlement money provided security, but more importantly, it funded advocacy. She began speaking at forums focused on immigration enforcement reform, her testimony carrying weight because she'd experienced the system's failures personally. She emphasized the need for enhanced bias training that actually changed behavior rather than checking compliance boxes. She advocated for mandatory body cameras that couldn't be disabled, creating accountability through technology. She pushed for citizen verification protocols that respected constitutional protections while still allowing legitimate enforcement. Her voice resonated because it came from lived experience rather than abstract theory. She spoke at law schools and policy conferences, at community meetings and congressional hearings. She shared the Ring footage not for viral views, but as evidence in presentations about the intersection of race, immigration enforcement, and constitutional rights. She became a sought-after expert, her calendar filling with invitations to educate and advocate. 8 months after the settlement, Miriam opened her own law firm in downtown Minneapolis. The practice specialized in civil rights and immigration cases, representing clients who faced the same kind of bias and abuse she'd experienced. She hired young attorneys hungry for purpose and trained them in the methodical approach that had served her for 25 years. The firm took cases other practices avoided, challenges against institutional power that required patience and precision. Her first major case involved a family wrongfully detained during an ICE raid, separated for 6 weeks, while bureaucracy ground through verification processes that should have taken hours. The firm secured a settlement and policy changes that prevented similar separations in the future. Other cases followed, each one building on the precedent and expertise Miriam had accumulated across decades. The Willow Creek neighborhood, which had witnessed her humiliation, now rallied around her renewal. Neighbors who'd waved tentatively at the new black woman tending her garden now stopped to ask about her work, to share their own stories of witnessing profiling, to volunteer support for her advocacy. Spring gardens bloomed around the neighborhood as they had the previous year, but now Miriam's presence had shifted from uncertainty to belonging. She began mentoring young lawyers, particularly women of color interested in civil rights work. She hosted monthly gatherings at her home, sharing lessons learned from cases won and lost, teaching the skills that couldn't be found in textbooks. The mentorship extended beyond legal strategy to survival, helping younger attorneys navigate systems designed to exhaust and discourage. The resolution circled back to the theme that had driven the story from its opening moment. One biased decision, captured by a camera Roland never noticed, had destroyed the perpetrator while empowering his victim. The Ring footage had served as more than evidence. It had become a symbol of how technology could enable accountability when institutions failed, how hidden strengths could turn apparent vulnerability into triumph, how humiliation could transform into purpose. On a spring afternoon, 2 years after the incident, Miriam returned to her garden. The tulips she'd planted that day had multiplied, their blooms more vibrant with each season. The roses climbed the fence in healthy profusion, properly pruned and tended. She worked the soil with the same methodical focus, though now neighbors called out greetings by name, their waves carrying genuine warmth. The Ring camera remained mounted beside her front door, its presence both practical and symbolic. It stood as a reminder that accountability could reshape lives, families, and systems. That truth endured when captured and preserved. That justice operated not through spectacle but through method, through evidence carefully gathered and consequences properly applied. Miriam paused in her work, glancing up at the camera's unblinking lens. It had witnessed her worst moment and enabled her greatest victory. It had recorded violence and preserved truth. It continued its silent vigil, ready to document whatever came next, a sentinel promising that power underestimated would eventually reveal itself, that endurance outlasted assumption, and that the systems allowing abuse could be forced to evolve when those they'd targeted refused to remain silent. She returned to planting, her hands in the soil, the spring sun warm on her shoulders, the future unfolding with the same patient certainty as the garden growing beneath her care.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.
True justice is an evolving process, and awareness remains your strongest shield. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to clarity.